You do have nice switches. You do have nice.
So good evening and welcome to everybody. I hope you can all hear me. A few reminders first, that this Sunday, August 9th at 3:30 p.m., Barbara Wassa will be conducting Let's Make Babka. And Sunday, August 23rd at 4 p.m., we will have the High Holiday Tune-Up with Scott Dembski. And part 2 of Crossroads in Jewish History has been changed to August 25th. Please make sure you make that correction. Originally, we had it down for August 11th, but it will now be August 25th, 7 p.m. I want to remind you to please put your questions in the chat box. I just want to take a minute to thank Alana for her creative ideas and hard work to bring these programs to you. And I also want to thank Rabbi for conducting this 3-part class. So without further ado, Programming of Temple Beth Am is proud to present part 1, Massada versus Yavneh.
Thank you, Judy, and welcome everybody. So just to give you coming attractions, our next session, I know we haven't even started the first one yet, but the next one will take us about 1,000 years after tonight's, and the subject will be Sephardim versus Ashkenazim, how the different groups got started, what they all mean, what they reflect, represent, etc., and some of the interesting conflicts between the two major groups of Jews. And then the following time, we will go 700 years after that to the beginnings of the Hasidic world and the opposition to them, which is a group of people called Mitnagdim. Mitnagdim means opponents. So you have the Hasidim and the anti-Hasidim. So that'll give us 3 hopefully very interesting dynamic splits and rifts that have existed for now a long time. So tonight's subject is Massada versus Yavneh. And I assume that of the two, most people have heard of Massada. Many of you have probably visited it and know what it looks like. And you've probably heard the amazing story of what happened on Massada. But there are parts of that story that often do not get told. And by putting it in the context of Massada versus Yavneh, we will have the opportunity to hear a dissenting view of whether or not the folks on Massada were great heroes or were they rogues, R-O-G-U-E. So that'll be part of the subject. Then, of course, after we hear about Yavneh, then we'll have to decide, were they heroes or were they wimpy nerds who just didn't want to rebel against Rome? So that'll be the topic for this evening. Let's talk a little bit about Rome and Jerusalem in the 1st century of the Common Era, because that's the background of the story. Even though the real story of Massada goes back 2 stages before then, and we'll get to that in a moment, but let's talk about Massada as we know it. The Romans came to town around 60-ish BCE, and that was part of their taking over the world from the Greeks. The Greeks were in controls from the 300s down to 60. By 60, they were past tense, and Rome was the new kid on the block. So what Rome did was, it all depended on who the emperor was and who the appointed governor of Judea was. That person was appointed by the Romans. And some of their emperors were mean and cruel and oppressive. Some of them were tolerant and encouraging and helpful. And most were somewhere in between. They had many more important things to deal with than little Israel at that time. So it all depended on who the emperor was. It also depended on who they appointed as the governor. Sometimes they appointed somebody local because they thought that would score points, with the local population. But in any event, as we all know, there was a major revolt against Rome that started in the late 60s. I don't mean the 1960s like we usually say in English. I mean literally the 60s, and lasted about 4 to 5 years. Did better than anyone expected, and Massada was considered to be one of the last battles in this long, protracted rebellion against Rome. Why were they rebelling against Rome? Well, it depends on who you ask. There were a lot of different opinions. I know that's hard to imagine that the Jewish people produced differing opinions on what to do, but this was certainly the case by then. If you took a scientific poll of the man on the street of Jerusalem, you would find that there were quite a few viewpoints represented there. Some believed that Rome was disgusting. Rome was disgusting because it was idol worshiping and idolatrous, and there's no room for any of that anywhere in the land of Israel. Israel is to be holy, the temple is holy, and blah, blah, blah. And therefore, anything and everything must be tried to get the Romans out of there. Then you have people on the opposite extreme who said to themselves, you know, the Romans aren't bad. It's pretty impressive. Some of them maybe took a cruise to Italy, and Royal Caribbean, I think, was starting back then, and took you to see the Colosseum and places like that. Very impressive. And must have been a lot of people on the streets of Jerusalem who said, wouldn't it be great if we had places like that in our holy cities? So you had those extremes. In the middle, of course, you had different viewpoints of moderation, you might call it, in terms of what to do and how to handle the Romans. It got to the point, apparently, that some of the fighting was infighting, and some of the Jews started fighting against each other. There was a particular group of extremist anti-Romans who were given the name Sicari, because that is the ancient word for knife, because these were people that hid knives under their clothing, and if they came across a Roman that they didn't like, or a fellow Jew that they thought was too much of a peace lover, they would take out their knife and stab them. And this is a terrible reflection of the rift that was going on. So that was one group of extremists. They had most of the Kohanim were the priests, and they were occupied in the temple. The temple was their bread and butter. That's where they worked. That was their profession. That's where they got their salary from. And that's how they fed their families, based on the work they did in the temple. So they were, of course, inclined to do anything to keep the temple standing. And that meant, to a large extent, supporting the Roman government, because without the Roman government supporting their right to maintain the temple would have gone away. So you had the Kohanim were pretty much, relatively speaking, pro-Roman. Then you had the rabbis, the people whose names we read in the Talmud. And most of them apparently tended to be more on the side of pacifism, peace at any cost, no matter what it took. And of course, you had a lot of variations in between. So it was an interesting time. The other thing to know as a piece of background is how do we even know about this time period? And the answer is there are 3 basic sources of written information about the Romans vis-a-vis the state of Israel, or the country of Israel at the time. The first one is the Talmud, which wasn't written yet, but it was preserving orally the traditions that eventually got written down in the Talmud. You also had, of course, the New Testament, but that was written by a group of people called the first Christians. Clearly, they had an agenda, just as the rabbis did, who were producing the Talmud. Then you have a third character, a gentleman by the name of Josephus. Very interesting life story. He starts out as one of the officers in the Jewish army, one of the people who was their leading general in the rebellion against Rome. But as the war went on towards the end, he switched sides and switched allegiance. And he went over to support the Roman side because he felt the Jews didn't have a chance. He also felt it wasn't a worthy war. The Romans weren't so bad. So when he moved, now, in addition to being a great general, he was also known as an historian. That's what he did before the war started. He wrote history books, and they were depended upon to learn about the generations before them. So what happens is when he first goes over to Rome, he kind of handed himself over to them, and he's now their prisoner. And he writes a major history of the Jewish people that is designed to curry favor with his new hosts. He wanted to sound as Roman as the Romans. And so his version of the history of the Jews was written with an eye towards reflecting better on the Romans than the Jews, which doesn't mean everything was wrong, but it does mean that he had a prejudice, a bias, and you don't want that in a historian. After a decade or so of being comfortable and popular and having written now a bestseller for the Romans, he went about writing another history of the Jews. This time, it was considered more objective because he wasn't trying to convince anybody that he was a loyal Roman anymore, because he had already proven it. So there are differences in the details told in one of his history books compared to the other. And you don't have to worry about which one's which, because none of us are going to remember that. But in any event, those are the three major sources that we have. So how do you decide which of the three you want to believe in? Well, for centuries, we Jews only believed the Talmud because we figured that was our stuff. And so we would never distort the truth. So the Christians, you can't trust them. That's how people thought centuries ago. And Josephus, you don't know if he's a Roman or not. So we're not going to trust either of those. We're only going to trust the Talmud. The Christians, of course, had the opposite vantage point. They only trusted the New Testament. And of course, everybody else trusted Josephus. So what modern scholars tend to do is they look carefully at how all three portray a specific event. And if 3 out of the 3 say pretty much the same thing, you know it's probably an accurate reflection of reality. If 2 out of the 3 say more or less the same story, even if the one that doesn't is the Talmud, we go with the majority vote. And that's pretty much how history has been told. So much of what we know about the first century is based on these 3 places. Now understand that all 3 of them, and I'm saying this as a rabbi, that even the Talmud, certainly the New Testament, and definitely Josephus, especially the earlier one, are reflections of bias. And therefore, they're not necessarily reliable versions of reality. Having said that, there are certain things that we do know. Archaeologists are experts in reinterpreting stuff. They dig in the ground and they find things like coins, like pieces of pottery that you can tell were once a jug of some kind. And sometimes you have writing on them or decorations. And that's how the archaeologists are able to figure out when a particular piece of pottery was made, who may have made it. They're so good at their work, the ones who are really professional, that they can look at 7 different pieces of pottery and identify 7 different ethnic groups that produced that piece based on the size, the shape, the color, the decoration, whether there's ornamentation on it and what kind, like a handle. Even a simple thing like a handle can tell them who made it and more or less when. So a lot of what we've learned is from archaeologists as well, digging into the ground. Now, one of the things they did find are 11 pieces, this is on Massada, are 11 pieces of pottery, and each one was clearly not meant to be a pot, or a pitcher or something like that, but were used for something specific because each one had a Hebrew name written on it, painted on the piece. Now that is what led to the historians suddenly revisiting Josephus from 2,000 years ago and coming across something he wrote about Massada that they never took that seriously because they didn't think they could trust him until they actually found in the 20th century these 11 pieces of pottery with 11 names on it. And one of the names was Ben Yair. Elazar ben Yair was the leader of the group of people for whom and from whom the whole Massada story unfolded. So let's quickly review the history of Massada, the story that happened during Elazar ben Yair, and then we'll put that aside and talk about Yavneh. And you'll see why in a moment. Here's the story with Massada. Massada you have to think of in three different stages of history. The first one we don't know a whole lot about, but it goes back to the time of the Maccabees. There are references in ancient writings. Now the Maccabees were under the Greeks, not the Romans, so it was before that. And the whole story of the start of the Maccabean story, the whole Hanukkah story, goes back to about 165 BCE. Apparently, all the way back then, where there are indications that people from that world and that time ended up living on Massada. Now, why would anybody live on Massada? If you drive past it and you're going along the Dead Sea on one side of the road and all these mountains and hilly, sandy areas on the right side of the road, that's assuming you're going south, of course, there are lots of mountains. And the one, when you pass Massada, you can't see from the road because you're kind of far away how different it is from all the other mountains north of it and south of it. You could look at 6, 7, 8, 10 different mountains next to each other, and you wouldn't be able to pick one out of a hat. So what made Massada different that people would want to live up there? Well, for those of you who've been there, you know the following. You know that the top of it is flat. Once you get to the top, it's not one of these gradual climbs. I mean, it is until the top, and the top itself is totally flat, and therefore you can cross from one side to the other. Imagine a football field, a couple of football fields. If there were no structures on top, you would be able to play a great game of football. Of course, you'd be in 120-degree heat, and that might be a cause to rethink your activity. But that's what you can do on Massada. It's totally flat on top. Secondly, they found bodies of water stored in there, or places where water had been stored, which means somehow they figured out a way to get water up from the valleys down below. So that's something, especially in a hot desert climate, that you're going to find advantageous. The third thing is that the northern side of Massada has a three-part ridge, starting from the flat top and then going down and then out a little bit and then down again. And that meant you had a good vantage point to see where anybody might be coming to attack you. And therefore, the structure was helpful to defend your position on top of the mountain. Now, that's pretty much the physical outlay. The Maccabees, or whoever they were during the time of the Maccabees, came, occupied it, built certain structures that had remained all throughout. So the experts can, again, walk on that mountaintop and say, this structure is from the Maccabees, this one is from King Herod, and this one was from the time of Elazar ben Yair. Let's get to Herod. Who was Herod? Herod was a half-Jewish, and I don't know if it's from his stomach up or his stomach down, but he's called half-Jewish, had an Idumean parent, so he was half and half. But that half was why the Romans thought he would be a good candidate to be the king of the Jews, or the governor of the Jews under Roman emperorship. So he gets appointed, And one of the things he did was he loved to collect taxes from the Jews because he loved to spend money. And what he loved to spend money on were huge buildings, impressive structures all over the place. One of the things Herod succeeded in doing was renovating the temple in Jerusalem. He didn't build a temple, but it's often called Herod's temple because of the work he did to renovate it and make it magnificent. Now we're talking about the second temple. The first one was destroyed by the Babylonians, 586 BCE. That has nothing to do with our story tonight. 7,500 years later, they started working on rebuilding it, and it took a while. They finally did, and it was a relatively modest structure until Herod came along, and he is more or less the year 1, give or take a few years, BCE, and dies a couple of years into the Common Era. But during that time, built major structures, and of course, he impoverished the people by the collection of taxes to build all these structures. He decided he wanted to be a snowbird. Believe it or not, it didn't start with Florida. Started with Massada. Wanted to be a snowbird, because if you're in Jerusalem in the wintertime, it's pretty cold. And you don't have heating machines back then in those days. So he decided to go find a location to build a summer palace. A palace that would have all the things we just outlined before. A flat top so you could build certain structures, and a palace for himself and his family. Water so they could bathe and drink and do whatever they needed, and to be able to have the vantage point of being able to defend themselves. So he decided, having heard about this Maccabean structure called Massada, he decided to go make Massada his winter home. And he goes there and builds a magnificent palace, and parts of that palace are still there. Mosaic floors and walls are still there, all from the time of Herod. And so you're talking about the year 1, up to about the year 5 CE. And then after Herod's done, nobody else paid much attention to Massada. It was pretty much ignored. And it was ignored for about 60 years until the revolt against Rome. Now we're talking 65, 6, 7, 8, 9. And the war has not gone well. And life in Jerusalem has been very difficult because of the inner fighting going on. And so a small group of radical anti-Roman Jews decided to flee Jerusalem because they felt they didn't have a chance against the Romans there. But if they went to some other place, maybe they could hold out and preserve their lives. And so they decided to go check out Massada. And when they came there, this palace was there. And they used that. And they transformed other structures into stables for their horses and food storage places for food. They wanted to get a nice group of people living there, hopefully forever, but as long as they could, and hold out and be able to defend themselves against the Romans if the Romans ever found out where they were. And that's exactly what happened. Jerusalem ended up being destroyed. That's what Tisha B'Av is all about. The temple was burned down. Most of the structures of Jerusalem were burned to the ground. People were killed right and left. Some of them ran away. But 969 of them were followers of Elazar ben Yair, one of these right-wing radicals who just wanted to fight to the death, and all moved to Massada. And they lived there for a good 2-3 years, relatively peacefully. Nobody knew and nobody bothered them. Until the war with Jerusalem was over, because Jerusalem was in ruins, and the Romans were trying to extinguish the last vestiges of the revolt. And they heard about this group of Jews on Massada, so they sent a general with some troops down to Massada, and they built encampments, which you can still see, surrounding the mountain, and began to fight back and took it over. The war lasted 2 years, which is pretty amazing. And Elazar was their leader and commander-in-chief and everything. He was the guy in charge. Until it got to the point that the Romans were building battering rams and ladders that allowed them to climb higher and higher and higher and get closer and closer. And at some point, the end was clearly near. And that's when the so-called heroic story of Massada occurs. Elazar ben Yair realizes, after watching and seeing the Romans reinforcing themselves and the equipment that they had, they didn't have a choice. They didn't have a chance. So Elazar ben Yair, as he sees the Romans coming higher and higher and higher up the mountain, ready to take it over in a moment's notice, he gathers together all the men in the shul, the synagogue that they have up on top of Massada, which you can still visit. And he gathered them all there, and he tells them the following: we're going to have to do something drastic. Now I'm going to ask Alana to flick on the first source so we can read, supposedly, the actual words of Elazar ben Yair. Here we go. Quote from Elazar ben Yair. We can scroll down a little bit. Here we go. This is what he said to them, and it was preserved in the books of Josephus. Since we long ago resolved never to be servants to the Romans, nor to any other than to God himself, who alone is the true and just Lord of mankind, the time is now come that obliges us to make that resolution true in practice. We were the very first that revolted, and we are the last to fight against them. And I cannot but esteem it as a favor that God has granted us, that it is still in our power to die bravely and in a state of freedom. What he went on to say and suggest was, the only choice we have, we don't want to give up. We don't want to surrender. Because if we surrender, it means they're going to take us as slaves all the way to Rome. And they are going to do unimaginable things to our wives and to our children. They're going to kill us, the men, instantaneously, and take all the women with them as their personal mistresses and slaves. And we don't want that to happen, and we don't feel that that's the right way to proceed. It would be much better for us to take matters into our own hands. Fighting them is no longer going to help. The only choice we have is to take our own lives and those of all of our families, all 969 of us. And this is the way he suggested we do it. Each man will be responsible for killing his own family. And there will be 11 men left at the end, 10 of you and me. And we're going to put all those names on a piece of pottery, and we're going to pull them kind of like out of a hat to decide who has to kill the last 10. So each one was assigned, by pulling the stone, who he had to kill. And he would do that, and then somebody else would do that, and he would be the last one left, and he would kill himself. Whoever pulled the last stone. It wasn't him, by the way. So that's the story of Massada. And the Romans, shortly after that, made their way through the defenses that were there and saw all 969 dead bodies. And it rattled them. It did what Elazar ben Yair felt it would do. It robbed them of the ability to go back home and brag that they defeated the Jews. Because by doing what Elazar was recommending, it meant they took their own lives. It wasn't the Romans that killed them. It therefore wasn't the Romans that defeated them. And they would never be able to face the Roman public with conceitedness or anything to that effect. That's the story of Massada. And when you stand there and your guide describes these events, often reads what we just read, it's a very chilling event. In modern Israel, this story has taken on new meaning. because they had a motto that said, Massada shall never fall again. And it's kind of been a motto of the Jewish nation, that we can never allow ourselves to be again in a position where we have to make that choice. So that's the story of Massada. And it's very emotional, and it's very problematic. You have a right to ask, I thought we Jews don't believe in suicide, and isn't this suicide? The answer is sure, but it's also extenuating circumstances, which is why it's a complicated question. I'm not going to say they were right, and I'm not going to say they were wrong. I am going to say that it was a powerful moment in Jewish history, and it's an emotional moment and place to visit and to experience and to see all these ingredients playing themselves out while you're actually there hearing the story. For now, let's put that aside and let's talk about another leader of the Jews at the same time, whose name some of you may have heard, and that is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of the greatest rabbis to ever live. He was living in Jerusalem at the same time as the revolt. And he was there the same time Elazar ben Yair was in Jerusalem. Whether they ever met or spoke to each other, no one knows. But clearly, they both represented different approaches to how to deal with Rome in the life in which we now find ourselves. Now, there's one very famous story that many of you, I'm sure, have heard of it. You may not have known that it was Yochanan ben Zakkai involved, but it has to do with a coffin, pretending he's dead, and by that ruse, getting past the Roman guards to the gates of Jerusalem. So let me quickly tell you the story, and then we'll look at some Talmudic passages and quotations from Yochanan ben Zakkai. And after we do that, then we can compare the two, which is the ultimate purpose of tonight's discussion. So in this famous story, the Romans have surrounded Jerusalem. They are besieging the gates to the city, so they control access and egress. Anybody going in or out has to go past the Roman soldiers. And at this particular point, when the war has not gone well, the revolt, and some of the rabbis were even opposed to the war altogether, Yochanan ben Zakkai tells his students, we have to do something desperate. And so he came up with this plot he told the students, pretend that I, your teacher, died, and the Romans have honored our Jewish practice of not allowing any burial within the walls of the old city. So you'll tell them that your teacher died. We have to go outside the city to bury him, and then we'll go right back in. So they come out to the gate. They come up to the Roman guards. The Roman guards, of course, say, where are you going? Who are you? What is this about? They tell them their teacher died. And according to one version of the story, the guard said, okay, go ahead. According to another version, which makes it a little bit more interesting, they were suspicious. So they took their swords or spears and shoved them into the coffin to make sure that, and by miracle, they kept missing the body of Yochanan ben Zakkai. So they finally said, go ahead. In any event, whichever version of the story you prefer, they get past the guards. They go to where Vespasian, the Roman general in charge of the entire revolt against Rome, is positioned. And they open up the coffin. He comes out, and they say, you got to take me to Vespasian. So Vespasian has him come visit him because he heard of him. He knows who this guy is. And Vespasian said, I heard what you did to get past my guards. That was pretty impressive. You must want something. What is it? And so the rabbi says, what I want is permission to open up a school in a town called Yavneh. Now, most people don't even know where Yavneh is. Even Israelis don't. But if you are standing in Jerusalem and facing Tel Aviv, which means a little bit northwest, but due west, if you went south, if you went all the way to the coast, Mediterranean coast, where Tel Aviv is, and headed south just a little bit, you'd find yourself in Yavneh. And it was a little town back then, but it was close to Jaffa, which was pretty well known, and that had a port. So that was a pretty important city. It was way before Tel Aviv was anything. And Vespasian laughed in his face. That's it? That's why you did this whole cockamamie thing with the coffin? Just to open up a school? Go ahead. Who cares? So what happened is he goes to Yavneh, he opens up a school, and slowly but surely, now that the war against Rome is pretty much over, all the rabbis all throughout Israel who ran away from Jerusalem during the revolt to save their lives and those of their family, they heard that Yochanan ben Zakkai opened up a school in Yavneh, and slowly they started gravitating towards Yavneh from all over the country, wherever they were. And before you know it, Yavneh became a major academy of Jewish learning. And in fact, it took the place of Jerusalem as the seat of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish court, the Jewish tribunal, and the rest is history. So Yochanan ben Zakkai leaves Jerusalem more or less the same time that Elazar ben Yair leaves Jerusalem. One goes to Massada, the other goes to Yavneh. Both of them are heroic in totally different ways, and it's up to you to decide whose heroism was the better brand. Was the killing of all those lives inappropriate? Was it wrong? Was it immoral? Or was it so incredibly heroic that we can't imagine anything other than that? On the other hand, was Yochanan ben Zakkai too much of a wimpy leader who refused to fight against the Romans? And maybe there are times that that's the only choice you have. Is pacifism an easy way out? These are the questions you can't help but ask. But let's find out a little bit more about Yochanan ben Zakkai's worldview. So Falana will now move to the other document. We have a whole bunch of quotes from Yochanan ben Zakkai. They're all found in the Talmud. Everybody still with me? Or did you all fall off the side of Massada? I don't know. We'll get to your questions soon. Here we go. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai received from Hillel and Shammai. Now, most of you have heard of Hillel, one of the greatest rabbis of all. But the reason he was great is because of the arguments he had with his buddy Shammai. Hillel and Shammai always argued. If one said black, the other said white. And we're learning from this passage that Yochanan ben Zakkai was one of their students. To be one of their students, you had to be a hoo-ha. So that's just the first thing we learn about Yochanan ben Zakkai. The second one, we can scroll a little bit more, gives you a little bit of background on his personality. A little more scrolling. There we go. Good. Tangentially, the Gemara mentions that they said about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai that no one ever preceded him in issuing a greeting. In other words, if you encountered him on the street, he was always the first one to say, "Hi, how you doing?" He didn't wait for you to say it first. No one ever preceded him in issuing a greeting, not even a non-Jew in the marketplace, as Rabbi Yochanan would always greet him first. Now, this is reflecting the fact that his attitude was not one of showing any difference in the way he treated Jews or non-Jews. He said hello to everybody. How are you to everybody? He wanted non-Jews to feel they were part of Jerusalem. And this is kind of a reflection of that personality. Let's scroll down on some more. Let's go to the English part. The Gemara relates Abba Sikara. Remember I mentioned the Sikari before. So the Sikari is the name of the knife wielders. So this guy was one of them, the leader of the Zealots of Jerusalem. and the son of the sister of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So one of these radical anti-Roman zealots was Yochanan ben Zakkai's nephew. Amazing. So Yochanan ben Zakkai sent a message to his nephew, come meet me in secret. And Yochanan ben Zakkai said to him, how long are you going to keep going on killing people? And because of what you're doing, you're making the Romans kill more of our people too. And they've surrounded the city, making it difficult to get food and water. And Abba Sikara said to him, what can I do? If I say something to them, meaning his other zealots, they will kill. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said to him, show me a method so that I will be able to leave the city. And that is followed by the story of the coffin, which is the next story down, so we can skip that. Okay. Let's go up a little bit. Up. Sorry. We can scroll up. Sorry to do that to you, Alana. This is a good one. Okay, there. This is after the war is over. The temple is in ruins. And Yochanan ben Zakkai is walking through the city with a younger rabbi, Rabbi Yehoshua. And they came across the ruins of the temple as they went on this walk. And Rabbi Yehoshua said, woe to us, for this is destroyed. And this is the place where all of Israel's sins are forgiven. Remember, in the temple is where you did your sacrifices. And among the various sacrifices were those asking for forgiveness. So if there's no temple, there's no sacrifice. That led people like Rabbi Yehoshua to believe that if there's no sacrifice, I can't get rid of my sins. There's nothing I can do. But Rabbi Yochanan said, don't go so far. My son, do not be distressed, for we have a form of atonement just like it. We have a substitute for sacrifice. What is that? Chesed, acts of kindness. Based on a sentence in the book of Psalms, God says, I desire kindness, not a well-being offering. Meaning God is saying, I don't need your sacrifices. I got enough of them. I've had enough over the years. I'm more concerned that you, my people, do acts of kindness. It's a beautiful concept, and it means that Yochanan ben Zakkai was totally willing to reframe the reality they were going through. And instead of falling apart because of the destruction of the temple, he was willing to rebuild Judaism even in a radically different way based on study of Torah. That's why he went to Vespasian to open up a new school outside of Jerusalem. There were Jews who probably felt, you can't study Torah any place other than Jerusalem. Yochanan said, sure you can. And there were people like Rabbi Joshua who said, there's no place to do atonement for our sins because we no longer have the temple. And Yochanan was teaching, sure we do. Acts of kindness. That's a different way of overcoming our sins. Let's scroll some more. We only have one or two more passages. This is a very interesting one when you have to redefine Jewish law based on new realities. The question is this. You all know that on the high holidays, it's going to happen this year, we don't blow the shofar when the high holiday is a Shabbat, meaning Rosh Hashanah. Because Yom Kippur, you don't really blow the shofar until the end when the holiday is actually over. So it refers to Rosh Hashanah. We got 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. If one of them happens to be a Shabbat, which is going to happen this year, we don't blow the shofar. And that had been a long-held practice. But Yochanan was willing to change it. With regard to the festival day of Rosh Hashanah that occurs on Shabbat, in the temple, they would sound the shofar as usual. So Yochanan is telling us that the restriction against blowing the shofar on Shabbat only applied outside of Jerusalem. If you were in Jerusalem, you could blow the shofar, even on Shabbat. However, they would not sound it in the rest of the country outside the temple. After the temple was destroyed, Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai instituted that the people should sound the shofar on Shabbat in every place where there's a court of 23 judges, which he just established, of course, in Yavneh. So the point is that he was willing to reframe Jewish tradition, even a long-held one, in order to, he didn't want the people to spend the rest of their history, for as long as Jews survived, grieving a building. He understood how important and holy and sacred the temple was. It's not that he discounted it, but he was struggling with his people to rebuild their lives from the bottom up and to get over the terrible loss of the destruction of the temple. Without waiting for the temple to be rebuilt, we have to rebuild our lives from inside out, and that's why he came up with this suggestion. Let's go down a little bit more. The same issue applies to lulav and etrog. This passage tells us that just like you didn't sound the shofar on Shabbat, during the days that the temple stood, the only place you did lulav and etrog for every day of Sukkot was if you were in Jerusalem, near the temple. But outside of Jerusalem, you only held the lulav and etrog for the first day. And again, Yochanan ben Zakkai made a change that from now on, no matter where we are, where there's a Jewish community, we'll use the lulav and etrog every day throughout the holiday. That practice we still continue today. I believe that's the last passage. Let's, Alana, let's make sure. I think it is. There's one last quote that I want to share with you from Yochanan ben Zakkai. It is a very powerful statement, and it's unbelievable in its boldness, in the idea that he reflected. And it goes like this: if you, an individual Jew, happen to be planting a tree anywhere in Israel, in other words, if you signed up for a JNF trip and you're planting a tree, you're in the middle of planting a sapling, and in the middle of that process, you hear someone say, the Mashiach has arrived, the Mashiach has arrived. You'll never believe how the sentence ends. He says, if that's what you hear, finish planting the sapling and then go and welcome the Messiah. Wow. That's a reflection of how powerfully energetic and creative he was, and willing to make severe changes for rebuilding from within, a spiritual rebuilding, even more than a physical rebuilding. So, in conclusion, I will tell you the truth, that I've taken over the course of my rabbinic career many, many groups to Israel. And of course, Massada is included. We never go to Yavneh, frankly, because between me and you, there's not a whole lot to see there. There's fields and farms, and that's about it. And there's no relics from this time period to visit. There's no plaque that has Yochanan ben Zakkai's name on it. So we don't go to visit Yavneh, but every time we stand on Massada and hear the story of the heroism of those 969 people, I never let them leave the mountaintop without telling the story of Yochanan ben Zakkai and Yavneh, so that as we leave Massada, we'll hear both stories and weigh the two carefully in our hearts and in our minds. Clearly, we are torn by the struggles and decisions both of these gentlemen had to make. And there are things about Elazar ben Yair that are amazingly heroic, and there are things that about his decision that one could say is relatively repulsive, if we're going to be honest. I don't want to take away from the heroism. But with that, let's see if you have any questions.
Okay, so the first question is from Linda Storfer.
Hi, Linda.
With the destruction of both temples, under which group did the Jews suffer the most, the Babylonians or the Romans?
Well, what seems to be the case is under the Babylonians, there was not a whole lot of suffering. Once they conquered Israel and destroyed the temple, and the reason the temple was destroyed, it was a political military decision based on a poor military decision made by the Jewish king at the time, who the prophets like Jeremiah and Isaiah kept warning him against fighting against Babylonia. The kings didn't take their advice, and we lost the war because of that. But once the Babylonians completed their conquest, there's no indication that life in Babylonia for the exiles was necessarily one that involved any suffering. During the Romans, as I said at the beginning, it all depended on the particular emperor at the time. Some of them were benign, some of them were pretty tough. So I would have to say, on whole, Roman life under the Romans was harder.
Okay, the next question is from Judy and Andy Byrne.
Hi, Judy and Andy Byrne.
Is it true that there were a few people who survived the mass suicide on Massada? I think your pause, like, I think your iPad or computer has frozen, Rabbi.
Try again.
There you go.
Are there people who survived what?
The mass suicide on Massada, that there were a few people.
Yeah, a handful. Apparently a mother and a few children apparently survived. This is all alleged because we can't verify it, but it's likely that somehow they hid away, and maybe it's from them that the story was spread to others. But at most, it was, you can count on one hand.
Okay, the next question is from Mark Greenlow.
Hi, Mark.
Why can't other rabbis change any rule that they want? I think you're paused again, Rabbi. Rabbi?
Alana, maybe if he tries to come in again.
Rabbi, do you want to, oh, can you hear us, Rabbi?
He keeps
You can
freezing.
answer in the chat room.
Rabbi? Rabbi, do you want to sign out and then sign back in?
Oh, I'm back.
Perfect. Okay. You're
We're
back.
back on?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi.
Perfect.
So part of the training to be a rabbi is to learn how to struggle with tradition and change. Obviously, part of the reason there are different denominations is there are agreed upon methodologies that encourage change and others that discourage change. So a lot of it has to do with your training, your upbringing, and your experience as a rabbi. But whenever you decide to make a change, it is an awesome responsibility, because you're not just changing for whoever asked you to make that change. You're making a change that all of history before us has chosen not to change. So you have to be really convinced that it's something you need. I can give you a simple example. It's not so simple, But when the coronavirus started, I was faced with the issue of Zoom minions, because it's very clear that there is a pretty solid definition of a minion being 10 people over the age of 13 in one place at the same time. On the other hand, it was pretty clear when we went into isolation and quarantine that this was a serious matter of the heart, of the soul, of the spirit that had to be taken into account. And so I was willing to consider during the time of the quarantining that a Zoom minion would be acceptable for us to participate in, and to include saying the Kaddish, which normally you'd have to have, quote, a real minion present. That was a very difficult decision to make if you're one who feels bound by the traditions of Jewish law. If you don't feel bound, which obviously in the denominational world, the Reform movement is much more likely to not be constrained by tradition. Their general approach is to be more constrained by contemporary needs. If you have a battle, an intellectual battle between past and present, in the Reform movement, the present wins. If you're in the Orthodox world, the past wins. And if you're conservative, you constantly struggle with both. That's the best answer I can give you.
So those are all the questions that we have in the chat. Does anyone have other questions? If you raise your hand with the raise your hand tool, I'll be able to see if anyone wants to speak, and I can unmute you. I'm just looking if anyone's raised their hand, or if there are more questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. And I'll just look through the screens. Frida, I will unmute you. Give me 1 second, Frida.
I really don't have a question. I just want to thank you, Rabbi, because I enjoy listening so much. I learned so much, and I think I speak for everybody to say how really wonderful this was.
Thank you.
And I've been to Massada and enjoyed it very much, but I had never heard of Yavneh, so I feel like I really learned something very good today. Thank you. I just wanted to thank you very much, Rabbi. I'm looking forward to the next 2 times also.
It's very sweet of you. Thank you. By the way, one of the most incredible experiences in visiting Massada is occasionally there's a flyover of Israeli Air Force jets. And man, they come out of nowhere when they're doing their training. And when you see them flying over Massada, when you've just heard this unbelievable story of what people did to preserve Jewish history, they didn't do it to end Jewish history. It's a remarkable coming together of 2,000 years ago and today, of ancient Israel and a modern Israel.
It's a very exciting experience. Really, it's like no other experience. I've traveled a lot, as you know, but that's like no other experience to be at Massada.
Yeah, thank you. All right, thank you all very much. Have a pleasant evening. Thank you, Alana, for your help. Thank you, Judy, for presiding. And thank the rest of you for sitting politely during all this.
And just a quick reminder to everyone, please register for Let's Make Babka through our website, so then I can email you the recipe, because we're looking forward to that on Sunday.
And I'm sure it's dietetic, right?
Yeah, very.
Very good. Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Rabbi.